Okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, just to remind you, this is part of the TIDES 2020 virtual demo event, which is taking place next week, October 20th to 21st. The theme of the TIDES this year is Converging Approaches to Sustainable Resilience. And this presentation is part of the breakout session, Nutrition, Public Health, and Integrated Cooking. So for today's presentation, or for today's talk, we are joined by Dr. Ziska, who is going to talk on climate change and its impact or its effects on human health and nutrition. Dr. Ziska is an associate professor in the environmental health sciences at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. He has published numerous peer-reviewed research articles related to climate change and rising carbon dioxide that address agriculture and food security, plant biology, invasive species, and public health. He has contributed to multiple reports, key reports. For example, the 2014 International Panel on Climate Change report, the 2014 National Climate Assessment, and most recently, the impacts of climate change on human health in the United States, a scientific assessment. Dr. Ziska's work has been featured in the media, including CNN, CBS, MSNBC, National Geographic, the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Wall Street. And we are really glad to have you here with us, Dr. Ziska.
Well, thank you, Constance. It's very nice to be here. I appreciate, as an academic, I always appreciate the chance to get up and talk about what I know. But I'm hoping that at the end of the talk today that you'll have a better understanding, perhaps a little more insight into the role that plant biology plays in the context of climate change and public health. Often when we think about this, we think about it in terms of primarily medicines or narcotics. So we see, for example, that plant biology has an effect with regard to things like cannabis, or it may have an effect in regard to poppy production and analgesics like morphine. But it also can have a role in terms of nutrition. And that's what I want to try, if I can, focus on today. Let's see if I can advance my slides at all. There we go. So I want to focus on the nutrition aspect of that. And I want to try and look at this nutrition aspect through a part of the climate change story that you will recognize, but also a part that is fairly unknown. And that is, we see carbon dioxide as the primary greenhouse gas, but it also plays another important role. And this is some very basic plant biology. What are the things that plants need in order to grow? I mean, there are some basic resources that are necessary. They obviously need light, they need water, they need nutrients, but as I mentioned, they also need carbon dioxide. These plants evolved at a time when the carbon dioxide was much higher than it is today. And so for about 90% of all plant species, they're not operating at optimal carbon dioxide. So what would happen to plant life, what would happen to all life, because plants are essential to life, if I were to change one of these resources? What would happen if I were to change light by 25% or nitrogen in the soil by 25%? You would expect a major change in terms of life cycles, and you would rightly expect that. But is that a good thing, quote unquote? Is that something that would be beneficial across the board? And that's where I think you need a little more insight. We know that it's important in terms of plant biology, and here's some work with loblolly pine showing that as you increase the carbon dioxide, you can increase the growth of loblolly pine. But there are over 400,000 different plant species. Is it fair to say that if I increase CO2, that all of the plant species will grow the same? And if they don't, what are the ramifications of that? Well, as luck would have it, there was a study done over about a decade at the Duke Forest in North Carolina. And this is a loblolly pine forest, similar to that one species that you just saw. But this was a major project. This was funded, millions of dollars funded through the Department of Energy. You had these big stands of CO2 being pushed into the middle of the forest. And did the loblolly pine respond? They did. The loblolly pine did respond. It grew a little more. But here's the thing. It wasn't the only thing that responded. In fact, there was another species in the understory of the forest that responded much more. And that species was poison ivy. And in fact, poison ivy, this was some work done by Jackie Moen, had a very significant response to CO2. So in fact, the winner, quote unquote, in this instance was not the loblolly pine, but in fact, it was the poison ivy. And if not only did it grow more, but it actually produced a more virulent form of erythritol. Erythritol is the oil in poison ivy that can cause contact dermatitis. So to say, well, gosh, CO2 is a plant food and therefore it's going to be uniformly beneficial isn't really quite correct. The other part of CO2 is how does it relate to what else is going on in terms of the plant? So if I increase carbon dioxide, what does it do in terms of the nutritional components? How do these two things tend to relate to each other? Because while carbon dioxide is going up and it's affecting plant growth, as we just saw, what's it doing in terms of nutritional content? Because the soil nutrition isn't changing. What does that mean? What are the ramifications of that? Well, obviously the one I want to focus on today is food and nutrition, but there are others. What about medicine? What about narcotics? What about plant-based allergens? How are they changing? It's a very complex, a very sophisticated subject that we don't think about. We often look at plants as being very simple organisms, and that's so far from the truth. They are sophisticated, multi-chemical factories that you can only imagine at what they're capable of. So let's look at it from the perspective of CO2 as plant food, and let's look at it from a perspective of rice. Back in the mid-1990s, I was the project director for global climate change at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. And we did some of the first work looking at carbon dioxide and temperature in terms of how different rice varieties would respond. And one of the consistent effects that we saw, both for wet season rice and dry season rice, because rice is grown twice a year there, is that the percent protein, and obviously a very fundamental aspect of nutrition, declined. The more we raised the carbon dioxide, the more it dropped. That's kind of unusual. And this was very interesting. It's consistent with some other work that was coming out of Australia by Jan Conroy at the time. Odd. So let's go forward a couple of decades and give you some of the more recent CO2 studies from rice. This is work done using the same kind of system that you saw, or a modification of that system that you saw with at the Duke Forest, where again, we're pushing CO2 into the center of the ring, but in a more field-based situation to see how rice is going to respond. This is, I think, at Scuba in Japan, but we also had some work done in China as well. And our goal here was to look at as many different varieties as possible. Now, there are 18 different lines of rice that are shown here in terms of the change in percent protein that is occurring with projected changes in carbon dioxide. So as carbon dioxide gets to about 550 parts per million, and just to remind you, today it's 420 parts per million. So 550 will certainly come either in your lifetimes if you're young, or your children's lifetimes if you're old like me. But it's something that's going to happen. And as a result of this, what we saw consistently for a wide variety of different rice lines, very different genetically, you're going to see a drop in protein. And that's concerning, as you can imagine, particularly for poorer countries that rely to a great extent on rice as a source of nutrition. So that's the future. Let me look a bit on past for rice. And again, just if you didn't know it already, rice is obviously a major cereal, one of the most important cereals globally. So this is some work on 8 different rice lines, not for future change in carbon dioxide, but for the change in carbon dioxide that's already taken place. Because since 1970, carbon dioxide has gone up by about 30%, from roughly 300 to 400 parts per million, which is shown in this graph. So again, we see that there is this almost uniform decrease in protein with rising levels of carbon dioxide. And let me expand this a little bit more. We talked about rice. This is for wheat. This is for spring wheat. Some of the work that I did back when I was with the USDA. And we're looking at the percent protein in flour. And one of the arguments that I consistently get is, well, you know, breeders have been breeding for hybrids that grow faster, and maybe that faster growth is reducing protein, and that's really what you're seeing. You're not really seeing a CO2 effect. Fair point. Let's do that. Let's look at that. And what we found was that 100 years ago, when you were introducing wheat varieties here, has there been a change over time? Yes, newer lines tend to have less protein, but that is separate from the CO2 effect in terms of protein per se. So each of these lines, which was introduced at different times during the 20th century, when you give them more carbon dioxide, will also decline. So this idea that it's hybridization that's responsible for this change is not really true. We're seeing it separately as a function of different lines that are introduced at different times. They are consistently declining, not just for future carbon dioxide here, but for the recent change that we see here. And it tends to be fairly ubiquitous. I focused on wheat and rice, obviously the most important cereals, but this is some work by Daniel Taub looking at barley, rice, wheat, soybean, potato. And the number of studies that he's averaging is here in the parentheses. But it's a fairly ubiquitous effect in terms of how CO2 reduces protein, with the exception, as you can probably see here, of soybean. And what's special about soybean is that it's a leguminous plant. It can fix its own nitrogen and therefore can keep up with the increase in carbon dioxide. So plants like groundnut, soybean, can in fact keep up with the increase in CO2 and are not affected as much as some of the other plants with respect to protein concentration. So this is sort of the holy grail that we currently have. This is some work put together by Rockley Lolaz. And what we're seeing in terms of minerals is perhaps not too surprising. There's, I think, several thousand, these data are several thousand observations that he put together. With a future CO2 value of about 689 parts per million. And of course, what you're seeing here is that as the atmosphere becomes carbon rich, plants are becoming carbon rich. And the other nutrients that are soil-based are not keeping up for the most part. Again, soybean is the exception, but barley, rice, wheat, as we saw with the Taub data, are all declining. But there's this overall change in stoichiometry, where carbon may be going up, but nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, et cetera, are going down. And this obviously has some major implications in terms of both future food nutrition, but also perhaps, as I showed you, some recent changes, given that carbon dioxide has already increased by 30%. Now, we've looked at carbon dioxide in part because these kinds of outdoor experiments where you're pushing CO2 into the center of the canopy are hard to manipulate in terms of temperature. Now, there's some exceptions. This is a project going on in Guangdong, China, that I'm working with as an advisor. And what they're doing here is they're actually running hot water over the canopy in order to elevate the temperature within the rice canopy, in addition to adding the carbon dioxide. And of course, one of the questions, fundamental questions we had was, well, this increase in temperature, does that affect the role of CO2 in terms of reducing protein? And I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of data on this, I apologize. But this is some work done by a postdoc of mine, Wei-Lu Wang, who's looking at essential and non-essential amino acids. And what he's doing here is ambient carbon dioxide, ambient temperature, and then here's elevated carbon dioxide, ambient temperature, elevated carbon dioxide, elevated temperature. And I think the CO2 here is about 550, the temperature is about 2 degrees. But basically, when you look at the amino acids, there's no instance where if you add the temperature and the carbon dioxide, you reverse any decline that you see in terms of these particular amino acids associated with protein. In fact, there are a couple of instances I won't go through here where it actually decreases further. So the bottom line is, at least so far, and again, the data are limited, but at least so far, we don't see rising temperature and carbon dioxide simultaneously affecting, reversing, if you will, the CO2-induced changes with respect to protein. Now, we focused on crops, but of course, animal husbandry is a big part of agriculture. And here's some work. This was done by Augustine and Blumenthal in ecological applications, came out a couple of years ago. And this is a 7-year study where they looked at grasses, and they gave the grasses, again, ambient CO2, ambient temperature. But regardless of the temperature, if you increase the CO2, that's the EC here, you're reducing the percent nitrogen within the grass. And percent nitrogen, if you're not familiar with it, is a pretty good proxy for percent protein. So not only are you affecting it in terms of major crops, particularly wheat and rice, but you're also affecting it in terms of pastures, in terms of ranges and the animals that depend on those grasses. And those animals that fed on the elevated CO2 grass put on weight slower. So it isn't just in that context of human nutrition, but it's also in the context for plants, but also in the context of livestock. Now, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curve here, because if you're looking at it, we often think, understandably, look at things from a human-centric point of view. Let's look beyond that. Let's look at pollinators, because pollinators are obviously very important in terms of agriculture, but they're also important in terms of the real world. And you probably have been reading about things like colony collapse disorder for bees, the monoculture and biofuels that are affecting bees, the varroa mites, the neonicotinoids. Bees are having a hard time of it right now. So one of the basic fundamental questions we had was, well, okay, if this change in CO2 is affecting human nutrition, could it also be affecting bee nutrition? And so we wanted to look at protein and carbs. We know that bees are very good at getting sugar. I mean, you get a bunch of bees together, they do the little waggle dance. They tell you, go visit the sunflower that's 20 yards to the left of the 7-Eleven, and so forth and so on. That's where they get their carbs, but they get their protein, and they need 10 essential amino acids, but they get their protein from pollen. So any effect in terms of the nutritional component of pollen is going to have a major effect in terms of pollinators. And we wanted to look at this, not in terms of future CO2, but in terms of what the CO2 has recently done, keeping in mind that it's gone up by 30% since 1970. So how do we do this? Well, that's not easy. Well, let's look at historical evidence. And where do we begin with that? Well, let's go to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, right? Great place to go to if you're in DC. You got your dinosaurs, you got your elephants, and you got your Hope Diamond. And way in the back of the museum, right next to the Ark of the Covenant, okay, I made that part up, but you'll find herbarium. And in this herbarium, you'll find goldenrod. Goldenrod is a major source of pollen for bees and pollinators in the fall. If you're right around this time of year, you're traveling the highway, you look over to the field and you see a bright yellow, that's usually goldenrod. So we analyzed the pollen from goldenrod using a carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen analyzer. Again, nitrogen is a proxy for protein. And we also did some experimental evidence, really cool study done by Wayne Polly at USDA out of Texas. And what he's done, these sort of plastic Conestoga wagons that you see here, he adds CO2 on one end, and as the plants photosynthesize, they would draw the carbon dioxide down so that by the CO2 concentration at the other end of this Conestoga wagon trail is back to what it was historically. And we were very fortunate that there was, in fact, some goldenrod along this transect. So to make a long story short, looking at historical trends from the Smithsonian, we saw that, in fact, the estimated protein since the 19th century has dropped for pollen by about 30%. That there is this shift, as we saw with the stoichiometry, of an increase in carbon to nitrogen. So this is just historical. And then when we compared it to the experimental evidence from Wayne Polly's experiment, numbers are slightly different, but again, the trend is historically for the protein to go down. So we have really good evidence, we think, not just for agriculture, but for nature, that this increase in CO2 is having a profound effect in terms of plant chemistry and that effect is going to have consequences with respect to human nutrition, but also perhaps with respect to pollinator nutrition as well. And that's sorry, just quickly, if you want to know more, the papers and proceedings for Royal Society. Can the CO2 change in protein affect insect populations? Of course, that's the bigger question. You may have been reading about the insect apocalypse and all of what's happening in nature. There's a number of different published studies that show that as the plant parts, the leaves, the flowers, etc., decline in protein, insects make up for it by consuming more to get the necessary amount of protein. So we see the number of studies where the insect, the host plant, and the response to rising CO2 have all resulted in more consumption of that plant. And that, of course, will have some effect with respect to production and particularly in agriculture. One of the most recent ones, this came out this year by Elizabeth Welty, looking at it, again, historical trends, this time in Kansas Prairie, looking at how the rise in CO2 has affected the protein concentration of the grasses there and how that in turn is affecting grasshoppers and so forth and so on. This is you won't hear about this. You hear about climate change and hear about polar bears and hear about ice caps, but this is a fundamental thing that's affecting all life on the planet, and we really, really need to find out more about it. And we focused on protein because that's where we have the most information, but I'm going to go back to rice again for a moment. And I want to focus on two very crucial elements that are part and parcel of human nutrition, iron and zinc. And here's the 18 different lines that we looked at. There's variation in there, but it's clear that some of the lines are in fact showing a consistent decline in terms of the iron concentration and the zinc concentration, which of course has profound effects in terms of human nutrition. We also did a little bit more work in looking at the vitamin content. We didn't have a chance to do it for all the lines, but for all the China lines, which include hybrids. And I think, yeah, there was at least one US cultivar there, mostly of the indica lines. But the vitamins B1, B2, B5, and B9 all, again, significantly or substantially declined in terms of their content with rising CO2. I think just a reminder, the CO2 is about 550 parts per million. And then we got thrown this curve. Alpha tocopherol is vitamin E, and it went up with more CO2, which, yeah, what's going on with that? What's happening with that? So we put together a working hypothesis, and the hypothesis is simply this. And again, it's a working hypothesis. And that is that the percent change in the concentration of a vitamin relative to what it was at ambient CO2 may be related to the nitrogen concentration of the vitamin in question. So for example, in tocopherol, vitamin E, there's no nitrogen in tocopherol. It's all mostly carbon. So it went up when I gave it more carbon dioxide to the plant. On the other hand, about 22% of vitamin B9 is nitrogen, and it went down. So maybe what plants are doing is, with this very rapid rise in CO2, adjusting their chemistry to reflect this increase in carbon that's happening. We've tried to model some of this. This is some work that came out in Lancet Planetary Health. I think Robert Beach is a senior author on it. We're trying. It's complicated because we don't have all the information for all the different crop groups yet. But what we're seeing for protein, iron, and zinc, which is what we have the most data on, is that yes, it will affect as CO2 rises differentially for different regions around the world, and to some extent that's related to social economic status. So the poorer countries are going to be more affected than the richer countries. Here's the quote for that, Beach et al., Lancet Planetary Health for this 2019. And just to, some of the more recent work we're doing, because hey, caffeine is one of my favorite drugs of choice, is to look at how rising CO2 can affect caffeine. Again, this is obviously a compound that has a lot of nitrogen in it. And we got some interesting results. We broke it down to Arabica lines and Robusta lines. And what we saw was that as CO2 went up from 3 to 4 to 5 to 600 parts per million, those are the 4 dots there, that the caffeine concentration tended to go down. But what was really interesting is that it went down a whole lot more in Robusta than it did in Arabica. And then if you broke down the Arabicas, then some went down, some went up, and we have no earthly idea why that is. And we'd like to find out more about it. And so that's kind of an ongoing thing. And then there's more. What about carotenoids? And this is just a recent study that came out looking at gene expression of the carotenoids and the carotenoids themselves with more CO2, the decline of around 15%. And again, this is a very important part of human health, particularly on the antioxidant side. This is the link here. And then there's some, solely subjective things, like if I'm changing the protein concentration, what does it mean for food allergens? Here's some very simple data looking at 2 different peanut varieties, Georgia Green and Virginia Jumbo. They're different in terms of morphology and phenology. But we looked at Arachis H1, which is the primary allergen in peanut. And we looked at it in 2012 and 2013. The gray lines are ambient at the time, and then these are elevated at 650 parts per million CO2. And you can see, at least for Virginia Jumbo, for both years, we saw a consistent increase. So maybe protein's going down, but this is a legume, so it may not be changing the total concentration, but it's changing the kinds of protein that are there. There's a lot we don't know. So I know I'm over time, I'm sorry, but here's a quick summary if I can. There's ubiquitous data, I mean, as good as we can get, indicating consistent shifts in carbon to nitrogen. Carbon goes up, nitrogen goes down. There's obviously this chemical imbalance for many of the plants that we looked at. What's the basis for that? We're still trying to get a sense of why, but we think what's happening is that the soil and the air are changing in terms of what they're adding to the plant in terms of elements, carbon versus everything else. Vitamins, we need to find out more about what else is happening. We've got to just scratch the surface on rice, but so much more needs to be done. This has major implications beyond human nutrition. I tried to give you a sense of that with some of the pollinator work, but oh dear God, we've got to do more on that. Modeling this will be whatever 4-letter word you want to put in there. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be really, really hard, but it needs to be done. What other impacts are going on? What's happened to food allergies? What else could we be doing here? And yet, overall, this is an aspect that, again, in my humble biased opinion, doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves. And it really needs to get the resources necessary to begin to describe it, to begin to understand the extent of it, and of course, to begin to come up with ways to, sorry, my cat wants my attention, to begin to compensate for it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'd be happy to try and address any questions any